There's some. Well, we've made it. We are here at the end of another TheEdCollab gathering, excuse me, of another TheEdCollab gathering. First of all, before we move to our closing session, just a gigantic thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us today or watching us in the future. This gathering, like all gatherings, is not only streaming live, but will be archived all the way until our next gathering in September. So thank you whenever you're watching for joining us. A special thank you to all of our presenters and to our tech team. If you loved any of the sessions that you watched today, if you felt inspired by them, please do tag the presenters. You can find all of their social media information or ways of contacting them in their bios on each of their sessions. So if you happen to be watching this from YouTube or Twitter or somewhere else, please do go find them on the event page so that you can write to them. Also, a huge thank you to our tech team. This day would not be possible without the volunteers that are helping to gather all of the sessions, communicate with presenters, make sure that presenters look great, make sure that you have an easy way of moving through the day, making sure that Twitter is sending out all the updates that are needed. A huge thank you to all of you, Jessica, Carolyn, Amy, Kristen, for making today possible. If you are watching and you're someone that would maybe like to present or maybe not like to present, but you definitely would love to support behind the scenes, we are always looking for new members of our tech team. It's a type of role we get to interact with amazing people, and you get to support this incredible free no registration conference. So if that's you, if you think you'd like to help behind the scenes, in just a moment, I'll show you where to click and you can just submit your name and say, hey, I'd like to help too. And we're always looking for great tech team members. The tech team is awesome. And we spend all day on Voxer basically complimenting each other. So it's a lot of love too. A gigantic thank you to Lehman fam this morning. Her keynote was stupendous. If you missed it, or even if you did see it and you want to watch it again, it's also available on the website all the way until September. We encourage you to watch, but also share with others. If you felt inspired by today, a reminder that because there is no registration, because you didn't have to pay a thing to tune in to this amazing conference day, we invite you to pay the joy forward. So if there was anything that moved your practice forward today or helped you feel affirmed in the work that you're doing, we invite you to please click on our charity page, and you can go to it from the website or from that URL on your screen right there. And there you can learn about why these different charities were adopted, and you could decide to donate directly to one of them: Plan International, Hope in a Box, or We Need Diverse Books. Or you can pay the joy forward in any other way that you'd like, whether it's through donating to your favorite charity, volunteering somewhere, or even supporting colleagues at your school. We invite you to think about the ways that today inspired you and to help pay that joy forward. The TheEdCollab sponsors today's TheEdCollab gathering. It's our gift to the literacy educators in the world. And so feel free to come and visit us. From our webpage, you can visit our amazing blog. You can learn about our in-school professional development and other free resources that we share. So the end of our gathering day is always the big announcement about the next one. So drum roll, I hear you drum rolling wherever you are around the world. I hear you drum rolling. Our fall 2022 TheEdCollab gathering will take place on Saturday, September 24th. And we are excited to invite back a former TheEdCollab member and one of the very first keynotes that we had in a gathering, Donalyn Miller. Please join me online. You can tweet at her directly too and say, we're so excited to hear from you, Donalyn. Donalyn Miller, the book whisperer, will be joining us on Saturday, September 24th. Donalyn will share her support and love of readers and reading. And we also are celebrating with her her brand new book, The Joy of Reading, which you can pre-order right now. It's available through Heinemann and it's out in May. And in a really bittersweet, very special way, it's a book that she's co-authored with a dear friend and lover of literacy, Dr. Keri Lassane. We lost Keri in this world back in August of 2021, but she was an incredible advocate of children's literacy. She was a lover of all readers. She was a professor, a distinguished professor of library sciences, one of the best huggers in the entire world, if you were lucky enough to get a hug from Terry, author of several professional books. And this book, The Joy of Reading, had been a long time project with Donalyn and Terry. And while it feels awful to live in a world where Professor Nana isn't physically here with us, it feels like such a gift to know that her love and joy and care for educators and kids and readers and authors and illustrators is going to live on. So we invite you to celebrate the release of Terry's last book with Donalyn, which will come out in May. And we are so grateful to have Donalyn join us as our keynote speaker and to bring her and Terry's message of reading and love and joy with us on September 24th. And I'm fighting back tears right here, but I think I can do it. That day is a day just like today that's run by you, by volunteers on our tech team and by folks who are willing to propose a session and share their work literally with the world. And so proposals are open right now. If you're on our website page and you go up to where it says proposals, you can click there and you'll be taken over to the proposal form. They're open until June 30th. And we would love to have you join us on that special day. And when we say present to the world, we literally mean to the world. And I'm trying to find my slide from earlier so I can show you. Here it comes. These are just some of the countries that tuned in today. I didn't get to say hi to you earlier, but hi, Qatar, hi, Cote d'Ivoire, hi, Morocco, hi, Germany, hi, Thailand, hi, Brazil, hi, Switzerland, hi, Cambodia, hi, many, many others of you that are joining from all over. We hope that you will consider submitting a proposal to share your work with the world on this amazing day that will come up on September 24th. And thank you again, Donalyn, for being willing to share with us. So it is my pleasure, and I told our closing that I try my best to keep it short, and I did it. It's my pleasure to welcome back here and to introduce and reintroduce to you members of the Educator Collaborative's think tank. So the heart and soul of the TheEdCollab is our think tank. They are educators, practicing educators from throughout the world, classroom teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, college professors, consultants, authors, and everyone in between that join together monthly in order to study and learn and share our practices. And so these are just some of the many voices that are part of our think tank that are joining us this afternoon on this important topic. This afternoon, we'll be talking about thoughtful and proactive ways to respond to book challenges. Before we jump in, we're adopting two charities that we hope you'll check out and consider donating to. Hope in a Box is one of several different organizations, a nonprofit that creates boxes and surrounding materials of identity affiliated text to send to classrooms. Hope in a Box is particularly focused on LGBTQ plus identities. And Hope in a Box has a huge resource list, including some of the books that I have back here, of texts that you can apply as a classroom educator to ask for a Hope in a Box. And you get a huge, amazing box of LGBTQ authored and main character identified texts, as long as teaching resources along with them. And there's many other organizations that are similar to this that you also could consider giving to. We also are adopting We Need Diverse Books. We Need Diverse Books not only has been a champion and has really helped to push the conversation around windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors, to quote Dr. Radine Sims-Bishop, identity and representation in books, but they also work directly in supporting authors of color and other minoritized groups. They also work on the other side of publishing in supporting mentoring pipelines for the actual publishing industry to make sure that it's not just authors who are creating books, but there's those in the publishing world that are helping to accept and nurture those books into existence. So please consider during this closing keynote giving to either one of those charities or any from today or any that you'd like. And again, you can find those on the webpage. So I'd like to introduce to you, and we can welcome everyone on screen. And when we do that, I'm going to switch over here. Some of my colleagues from the TheEdCollab, Shawna Coppola, Dr. Cindy Gerwin, Dr. Keri Orange-Jones, and Dr. Lois Barker that are joining me in this session. And I'm going to just fumble for a second here to share my screen. Boop. All right, here we go. And so we wanted to present some idea. Oh, and I should also say, the presenters here are only some of the folks that helped to make this session possible. So there's a number of members of our think tank that also helped to influence our work here. We just want to acknowledge and thank them for their support as well, too. So living in the context that we're in now, with the number of colleagues, some of which have been members of our think tank, with the amount of challenges against books that has been taking place in our country recently. Shawna will share in a moment that it's not new, but there seems to be a very hot wave happening now. We thought it would be helpful to help you think about a few specific ideas around what's happening now and what are things that you could make sure are in place in your district to proactively and thoughtfully respond to what's happening. So without further ado, I'll pass off to Shawna, who will get us started.
Okay, thank you, Chris. That was great. And welcome, everybody. So whether you have experienced a book challenge as a teacher, a librarian, a media specialist, administrator, student, or whether you're simply just curious about the current wave of book challenges across the nation, we welcome you to this space as we think together about how to move through this moment in a way that is thoughtful, effective, and above all, humanizing. So we're going to frame this issue for y'all, and we thought we wanted to begin by sharing some common language. So we'll start there. I always find that that's very useful, and I think that sometimes the language around book challenges can be a little bit murky. So a challenge is when an attempt is made to remove or restrict text or materials based upon the objections of a person or a group. So challenges happen all the time and not necessarily lead to bans. And so when a ban happens, when something is banned, it really just means that the challenge was successful and that something, some sort of text or material has been removed from a particular space. So censorship, related, of course, is the act of some sort of authority, whether it is a classroom teacher, it could be a district or school board, it could be a legislator. When there is an act to suppress ideas and information, that is what censorship is all about. So book banning in itself is an act of censorship. So again, because sometimes, I know I'm just speaking for myself, but I think sometimes it's hard to wrap our minds around all of the things that go into this issue of book challenges and trying to keep track of who and what and where over time. It's really very challenging. And I'll give you a little bit of history in a moment. But because this can be so challenging and kind of murky, I find that it's really helpful to think of these big questions to help frame our thinking whenever there's some sort of book challenge or conversation around these sorts of things. So first, we want to make sure we're thinking about, in terms of patterns, who is doing the challenging and whose interests and ideologies are being protected. At the same time, whose are not. And you'll see over time, if we really look at the different kinds of challenges that have happened over time, that there's a very distinct pattern in terms of who is doing the vast majority of the challenging. What is being challenged or censored, obviously, is a really important question. What in particular? Why? So what is the concern or what is the issue? What is needing review, so to speak? And also, where is the challenge happening? And this is important because depending on where the challenge is happening, it could be happening in a library, it could be happening in a classroom, it could be happening in a storefront. So there might be something happening there. And when we think about where these things are happening, the where is really important. So one of the reasons why I think it's important to think about where in terms of libraries, and in particular, we're seeing a lot of book challenges connected to libraries, is because libraries have an obligation that other, say, corporations might not have. So under the Library Bill of Rights, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, there's actually a piece that talks about the importance of libraries challenging censorship in the fulfillment of their specific responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. So materials should not be prescribed, nor should they be removed because of partisan or doctrinal or ideological disapproval. So libraries are really in an interesting sort of unique position when it comes to book challenges and censorship. But regardless of the questions you ask, when you're thinking about questions, it's really important to think about or frame it around humanization and dehumanization as well. So hopefully these will help you with when you're thinking about different book challenges, these questions can help with that. But let's take a look at history, because I always find it interesting to kind of looking at the threads over time and trying to figure out how we got to where we are today. So this is, of course, nothing new. As long as there have been books, there have been book challenges. So just as an example, there are lots of rulers over time who have initiated book challenges and book bans. So you see on the very left-hand side of the slide, Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang was one such ruler who banned certain history and philosophy books to prevent being compared to past rulers. And so, like I said, this is not uncommon. So we have the Roman Emperor Caligula deeming the Odyssey to be too dangerous. So that was another instance where a book was banned by a ruler. King James I of England, I think it was a Shakespearean play. I might be wrong about that. But the reason for the book banning in that case was because the book was too saucy, which I thought was kind of fun to say. So I wanted to give that example. But again, this is nothing new, unfortunately. And in terms of the United States, many historians point to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin as the first widespread book ban in the US among the Confederate states because of its pro-abolitionist tone. So again, thinking about who's doing the banning, what is the reason, and why, how, where. These are all important things to consider. However, prior to Uncle Tom's Cabin being banned, there were certainly many others. The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption in the 17th century was banned for its criticism of Puritanism, and that was actually burned right near me. I'm in New Hampshire. It was burned on the Boston Common. And then also during the Grant administration, there were some laws. They were called Comstock laws. Some of you might be familiar with. And those criminalized any use of the United States Postal Service to send anything through the service that contained what was called obscenity, or that was deemed obscene. And this included information, pamphlets, handouts about contraceptives. So again, thinking about why and who is really important. Now, book burnings really became very popular during the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 40s. And they were also very popular during the moral panic around comics in the 1940s and 50s. There were many book burnings supported or hosted by the Boy Scouts of America. Often when folks were talking about challenging or banning or burning comic books, it was because they were often deemed vulgar or unsuitable for children. There were definitely some problems with some of the comics that, there have always been problems with any text, but certainly there were things that were questionable. There was certainly a lot of racist stereotyping in comics. There's a lot of sexism, but the folks who were calling for these book burnings were really focused on what was or was not suitable for children. And so a lot of horror comics were burned, a lot of comics that were deemed sort of communists were burned. And then during the Reagan era, so after kind of this moral panic around comics, we saw a decline in book challenges and book censorship during the more permissive era of the late 60s and 70s, when art was more permissive and explicit. But once the Reagan administration came around, that there's always, whenever there's more permissiveness or perceived social progress, we know that there's always a backlash, and there certainly was in the 80s when we saw a huge, enormous rise in book challenges and book bans. And this is actually when the American Library Association started their first banned books week in 1982. So today, again, we have a backlash to perceived social progress that really stemmed from a variety of things. So we have the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too and Time's Up movements. We also, in November of 2020, saw a record number of individuals who identify as LGBTQ+, who were either running or elected in November of 2020. And so all of that, of course, led to another backlash. And all of that perceived social progress is really fueling right now what we have is an unprecedented rise in book bans and challenges. And in particular, those that feature characters or individuals or authors who are LGBTQ+, and even more specifically transgender. So we're seeing really specific, a lot of specific challenges, as many of you are all too aware of right now. Just to give you a sense of numbers too, the ALA keeps track of numbers related complaints lodged against books in school libraries, and they have recorded a marked increase over the past year. So just as an example, in the fall of 2021, the association tallied about 330 incidents. And to give you some perspective, in all of 2019, the number was around 370 or 375. So in the fall of 2021, we had just about as many book challenges that were documented. The other thing to keep in mind too is that the reasons for banning books has really changed over the past couple of years. So if you look at the reasons in purple, if we look over time throughout history, typically the reasons for book challenges were around sexual explicitness, that kind of unnamed obscenity, inappropriate language was a big reason, and also the suitableness or unsuitableness of children. Again, thinking of those big questions, we want to think about which children are we talking about, who is being protected when we look at patterns around book challenges. And then now, if you look at the past year or so, we have many of the reasons are around the content, particularly LGBTQ+ content. Anti-police views was named a number of times in the past year, and things that cause discomfort, guilt, or anguish are also some reasons that we hadn't seen until now. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a historical perspective. And now we're going to get more specific around some of the processes and policies to help you when you encounter a book challenge. So I'm going to segue to the brilliant and beautiful Dr. Orange Jones.
Thank you, Shawna. I love listening to you talk about the history. It's so extensive, and I'm quite sure a lot of people don't realize how extensive the history of book banning is. So thank you for that. And I'm happy to be sharing this space with Dr. Cindy, and we work together on this and had some very interesting conversation about process and policy and why it's necessary. So Chris, if you could go to the next slide for me. So the process for text selection. So in our conversations, Cindy and I discussed that there is definitely two types of situations going on in terms of text selection. You do have library text versus classroom text versus textbooks for curriculum. So what is it? The process, we need to define that, because sometimes you will get challenges from parents or community stakeholders, and it is important for us to have this process in place. It makes it easier for us to mainstream. We have these steps to follow so that there's no confusion. If you decide to challenge a text or a parent challenges a text, this is the first step that we're going to go through, followed by whatever comes next. What does that look like? Each district have different nuances, different population of people. However, I think it's important for us to also make sure that we have some similar steps. We are all going through this. And in some cases, we're taking it to the next level in terms of lawsuits even, and taking it to a legal precedent. So it's important for us to have similar steps even. That way, when you look at case law, you want to be able to have some similarities in these processes. Again, what does that look like? Well, that's what all districts need to really work upon. And then again, language is important. Textbook selection is definitely relative to curriculum. So do you have different policies, or do you have different types of language? Similar policies for all three, but different language. So you have to ensure that your policy includes verbiage that addresses those differences, because when you select curriculum text, the children do not have a say in that. But as Cindy pointed out, when we had our conversations, when you're talking about classroom library or even the school library, it's a vast audience. You're talking about the students, and you want to make sure that there are texts available to them that address their various needs and the diversity, because we have so many students from different cultural, religious backgrounds, the LGBTQIA community, all these students, different abilities. We want to ensure that these libraries and our textbooks address these differences for our students. Can you go to the next slide, please, Chris? So when we're talking about these materials, they definitely need to address DEI. So we want race, creed, color, origin, marital status. All those things are really important, because we do have diverse families now. The illustrations and language that we see should promote positive images and varied lifestyles. We want to see a variety of families, traditional versus one parent versus working parents versus parents, two-parent homes with of the same gender, free of sex bias, free of cultural bias and racial bias, and non-human objects being referred to in a non-biased gender way. So the illustrations are important. I feel students like to see things that represent them. And sometimes this is the things that lead to the challenges. Like Shawna was saying, pictures and images and different lifestyles, which cause discomfort and guilt and anguish. But it's important for us to have these different types of texts in classrooms and in libraries, so students want to see something that represents who and what they are. The difference, again, like I stated previously, with a classroom library and a school library, a broader audience. Student choice is very important. Books that they read reflects who and what they are. So the process and the policy that we have in place, we want to ensure that we do not disenfranchise student voice. We don't want to do it with curriculum text, but we also don't want to do it with the text that children decide to go into the library and choose to read. So other things to take into consideration, and then Cindy is going to segue and finish the rest of our piece about policy. The stakeholders that are involved in text and textbook selection. I think this is very important. Not only do we need to have this process in place and what that looks like, but the who's involved with textbook and text selection and vetting those texts versus who's involved with the challenge process. So when we create this policy, the policy of how we're going to address challenge books, we also need to make sure that those people who are involved with choosing and selecting texts that we read in the classroom versus the library are not the same. Because as a person who's involved, and I've personally been on text selection committees for a curriculum, if I'm involved with that process and then someone challenges, it's very hard to kind of discern and separate yourself and not take it personally as a person who, oh, okay, I was on the committee that selected this text and now you want to challenge it. Sometimes it's going to be hard for people to differentiate between it has nothing to do with your personal selection or your ideologies that went into selecting these texts or textbooks. But it's just definitely going to be a conflict. How can you just be non-biased? So when we have our process in place, and the steps, we need to ensure that we have two different groups of people involved with selection, because we want to ensure that we select text that's accessible for all students and address all students' needs versus those people who are involved with the challenge process and making sure that they don't personalize. Curriculum standards, just as important as DEI issues. So when we look at our standards, we want to make sure that any books that we have the supplement curriculum addresses the student standards as well as DEI issues. And if we are careful, or I would say careful, but conscious of the steps that we take in selecting and being proactive, then we wouldn't necessarily have to be so reactive when books are challenged. So it's really important that we streamline a process. What is the first step? The book is challenged. What's the second step? You have a committee in place to vet the book that's being challenged and then come to a decision that everyone can agree upon. And there's always going to be someone who's upset, right? But at the end of the day, we want to ensure that we have diverse text in the classrooms, diverse text in curriculum, diverse text in the classroom libraries or the school libraries, and also make sure that when we do have book challenges, that the students don't lose their voice in the process. So now I'm going to segue to Cindy.
Thanks, Keri. I want to add one thing really quick. I was thinking of as you were talking. And of course, I can't remember the title or the author of the research study, but I can picture it in my head. And I think a lot of times we think that these issues are sort of problematic in our school communities that are already diverse. And the article talked about how the more homogeneous the community, the more we need diverse text, like the more we need to see into the window of other people's lives. So really, really important, because I think we sometimes forget that the more homogeneous, the more necessary these books really, really, truly are. So I'm going to kind of take that one step further where Keri started, which was talking about the selection process, to what do we do now that we've selected books and we filled our libraries or chosen our textbooks. How do we move forward if there's an issue? And so I would really suggest, and this is, I think, really hard for most teachers. We tend to kind of like curl up on our shells when all of this gets really bad. And I think that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. But to be more proactive and to just sort of come out of that shell and start inviting conversation with the kids, with their families, with our school communities. I think it's through conversation that we can really hopefully start to move forward on some of these issues. And that's so, so important. So one way we can do that, one thing that I have done in the past is by just sending out a letter at the beginning of the school year to parents and explaining a little bit about my philosophy of literacy, of reading, of making sure that I create an inclusive community where every child deserves their humanity, deserves to be seen and heard and valued in the text that I put in front of them. And so I have a pretty expansive classroom library, and as part of that conversation, I tell parents, I read a lot of the books, but I can't possibly read all of them. So a lot of this is incumbent on us working in partnership, parents and teachers, helping kids learn how to preview texts, when it's comfortable for them to explore into some different areas, and maybe when it's not yet comfortable, when they're not mature enough or ready for those things, and inviting parents to participate in that process. So usually as part of the letter, I say I have all kinds of things in my library because I have all kinds of kids who live different experiences. And what might be a perfect fit for one child might not be a perfect fit for another child. So has their parent, what do you want me? Like, how do you want me to inform you? Are you okay with your son or daughter making a choice? Do you want to participate in this decision if they're picking books? But really starting that proactive conversation can make a world of difference. And then you move into the informal complaint. So actually, it's interesting. Last year, I shared, we had a novel study with my whole class, and it was one of the first books that we did called Ban This Book by Alan Gratz. Funny, that was the book we chose. And one of the parents was a little bit uncomfortable with some of the language about why books were being banned, and didn't call me directly, but called the principal. And you know, just sometimes you just need to sit down and again, have a conversation. So the principal and I talked to the parent, we went through the book with the parent, and I said, I'm happy to change the book if they weren't okay with it. And as it turns out, you know, they just needed a little more reassurance of what was in the book and what was happening in the classroom. And again, I think it's our first instinct to kind of, I know my heart kind of stopped when I first heard that, to kind of back away and get nervous. But really, I encourage teachers to push through that and invite the conversation. Oftentimes, it's just, they just want to know, and just being able to have a conversation is enough to stop the complaint right there. Sometimes though, we move from an informal complaint to a more formal challenge. And when we go through that process, if your school or district does not have a formal policy and process in place, and I would encourage you to ask. It took me a while because as part of that book study or book club study, reading Ban This Book, the kids and I read about intellectual freedom laws, and we asked the school district for the book banning policy and read it and tried to revise it and update it. So it took me a while to actually find out that we did have one, because I didn't think we did. So check with your librarian is probably the best place to go. And then it should spell out what needs to happen. It usually starts explaining that informal complaint. And then if that's not resolved, there's usually a form that needs to be filled out, which I'll show you in just a minute, that gathers information. And then that formal challenge goes to a committee for reconsideration. And again, it's really important that that committee consists of all stakeholders. So students, parents, staff members, and it's really helpful if that isn't the same group of people that selected the text, because that's sometimes a really difficult situation to be in. And Chris, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. So typically the formal challenges include this type of information. So personal information, is it one person? Is it a group of people? What resource or book or text is being asked to be reconsidered? Have you read or viewed the entire resource? I think this one is really, really critical. People who are challenging it should have read it and should understand it and understand the context. A lot of times you hear just one single quote pulled out, and that's really sort of irresponsible to look at one line in a book or a text or whatever and not really consider all of the information in context and how that might apply to all of the people in a classroom. What are the concerns about the resource? And then any suggestions that would provide additional information or viewpoints are really helpful as well. And then the next slide, it's really important to note, however, that this one voice, it may be a really loud voice, should not dictate the removal of that text until after you've had a chance to go through this whole process. So no challenge material should ever be removed from a curriculum or a collection until it's gone through this process of a committee. And if the committee decides that that text needs to be removed, it usually gets voted on by the Board of Education, again, allowing people to have their voice. But it's really important that until that point happens, those things should not be removed. You can offer the student another text or something else in the meantime to kind of help make it a little bit easier and give some time for the process to move forward. But you don't want to just automatically remove. And so that's going to segue into our next section, which I think Chris is going to start us out with.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Keri.
Sure.
So just to highlight before we move to the who, in working with colleagues and other educators, some of which were kind of taken by surprise of some of the book challenges that were happening in their district in such a forceful and pronounced way. When Shawna shared that data with us, that is what a lot of districts have been feeling of this like sudden wave of people getting upset about text. And some of that is coordinated nationally. It's not just by accident that it's happening. Again, that goes back to who and why. But there's a reality that there are districts that don't have a formal process in place or have a very old process in place that hasn't been reviewed. Or as Keri had pointed out, some of these processes are about textbook selection, but they aren't formally written as also classroom libraries or other texts, because perhaps it's a school that moved to having classroom libraries. So we encourage you to check, just like Cindy said, check to make sure a process is in place. And I love that you invited your students to also help revise that. I think that's so powerful. Look that it's there. If it's not there, to put it in place. And I'm even going to go back to this slide and make sure you add language like this, so you have something to go back to when a challenge comes up. If you don't plan ahead, you'll be taken by surprise, and then who knows what can happen. Having a clear process in place allows you to go back to documentation, which many times can be legal documentation that allows you to make a clear argument about why you're making the choices that you made. If nothing else, it also buys you time to breathe. It buys you time for everyone to just and kind of go through this slightly prolonged process so everyone has a chance to fully think through the decisions that are being made. So if you have a process in place, it also matters who's involved in that process. And so Lois and I are going to take this last section. So one of the largest considerations we'd like you to think about while you're deciding what is your process and who's involved in your process is who gets to dictate whose humanity. Shawna started us out by thinking about making this a humanizing process, not a dehumanizing one. And so it's key to consider who's involved in the decisions around which books are selected, and probably even more importantly, which books are being challenged and reconsidered. And so one thing we suggest to you is that you make a very clear plan. You could even document this plan into your process, that you look for voices that are missing from the conversation, particularly if a book is being challenged based on identity. So there are, I don't have to say this to you, know this exists, but when you think about here in the United States, the way that some identities are given more power and privilege and others are what we might call minoritized, they're kind of forced to be smaller, have less power. Even if they are a large group, they have less power in decision-making, in various structures in the US, including school structures. If, for example, a text is being challenged because it's, if you look in the last column, LGBTQ, or if there is clarity that that's probably why it's being challenged, even if they're using language like child appropriate, one thing you want to check for is, do you have LGBTQ plus identities involved in that decision making? Are there identities of actual people or research that you found to help support why inclusion of that text matters? I'll just say, as a matter of experience, there are some school districts that have removed books from their classrooms by the push of a parent group and because a leader said that they should in order to review them. And no one in that decision-making was identified as LGBTQ+. There were people who self-identified as heterosexual deciding if these texts were appropriate in their children's classrooms. So if you look at who's involved in your decision-making, if you are minoritizing the voices that are already being minoritized in your community, you're doing a disservice to the humanity of the children, parents, educators that are involved in that group. So when you think about who's there, number one, you have to consider who you're inviting, but you also have to consider how you support them. Because you might invite a voice that is missing in usual decision-making to your group. And once they're there, they might still be minoritized within that committee. And then they have to fight against the oppression that's already happening in the committee because they're the only voice. So if you are in a role that gives you some power inside of that book selection committee, or if you're just a person like me who's just not going to take it, if there are some problems, please consider that it's not enough to invite voices. You also have to be ready and willing and prepared to support them. And so for a clear example of that, Lois is going to share an experience.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I am an educator and a parent. And so sometimes those hats merge together or they come on and off. And when my daughter's middle school announced that they were doing a one book, one initiative, a one book, one school initiative, I was ecstatic. I'm like, I'm applying to be on this committee. And so I was selected to be a part of the committee. We had to read and come together and discuss 3 books. Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, Ghost Boys, and I can't remember the other book. But Ghost Boys seemed to be the book that everybody was leaning to because it seemed very accessible to all grade levels, right? 6 through 8. But when I got to the meeting, I was the only Black parent there. There was also one Latinx parent, one Black staff member. The whole space was primarily a white space. As we were discussing the pros of the book, things that we liked, what I noticed was the voices that were against the book were the loudest. And a lot of the things that came up was it felt that the author had an agenda. It felt that it was anti-police, police propaganda. Our kids are young. They don't experience these things. They don't see these things. It's not a clear picture of society. Kids should be reading about happiness and unicorns and rainbows. And so I sat there for a minute, listening, trying to understand, and then I had to jump in, and I was trying to express my experiences as a Black woman in America, sharing that one, I too I've had interactions with the police that were very intense, and I had to question, how will this interaction, end for me? I've had men in my family have, very strong, intense interactions with the police, wondering how will this end for them. I mean, let's not forget 2020. Let's not forget Tamir Rice. These are real stories. My story is a real story. And so these things happen every day. Whether, if your kid lives in that bubble where they don't see it, it doesn't mean it's not real. And so in that space, I felt, again, here I am trying to justify my experiences and justify why my experiences and, the experiences that are similar are needed so our kids can develop empathy, or our kids can be aware of things that are happening around them. But as I was sharing this experience, I noticed I had no support. The support was really minimal, and it was really uncomfortable for me. Being there, trying to be a contributing parent, trying to be a voice of reason, but having no full support. But what I did do was offer solutions. I did not want it to end where the loudest voice, got to make the decision. So I offered solutions. I offered solutions like, well, if this makes you uncomfortable, then let's have parent talk sections. Let's invite a counselor. Let's invite the instructional coach to have sessions where we can prepare parents give them protocols, give them language, additional resources. So if this becomes uncomfortable for their kids or you talking about it with your kids, here are some things that you can do. But as Chris mentioned, I was excited to be invited, but when I got there, it was not the most pleasant experience for me. And so that moves us into our next segment about, who comes to the table.
So first, just to go back to Lois's story, if you're going to be at that meeting, you have to prepare ahead of time and be ready with either protocols in place in order to allow multiple voices to be heard and some really thoughtful discussion to happen. But you also have to be prepared to talk about things like power and privilege, to talk about whose voices are not going to be as loud in the room, whose experiences might be missing. You have to be ready to do that work. If you don't, then you're going to lose someone like Lois, who should be on your book review committees and doesn't want to be involved anymore because of a negative experience. So when you're thinking about policies that exist, we'd suggest that you certainly take these actions, but you might find ways to write them into your policy as well. The more that you, as an organizational leader myself, the more that you systematize good practices, the more likely they can continue. And so, for example, you might want to write into your policy things like audit the decision makers. What's their experience? How long have they been in the district? What is their stakeholder position? So their family, their students, their educators, they're at particular grade levels, their library and media specialists. What identity and experience are they bringing to the group? Also proactively build those relationships. Don't wait until there's a problem. If you go knocking on someone's door because they're not in your committee in the midst of some huge upheaval that's happening around the text, that's not an inviting space to bring someone into. Proactively build relationships amongst your staff, amongst your students, and amongst your families and your community so that you already have folks you can call on if you need them. And whether that exists or not, it's on you, it's on your committee to fill in the gaps. If you don't, as you do your audit, if you don't have voices represented, then it's important that you find other ways to fill in that missing information and experience. Perhaps it's through research and readings. Perhaps it's through community groups that you reach out to. For example, if you use GLSEN's school survey that they put out every few years, you have concrete data collected from national students on what it's like to be an LGBTQ+ student in our schools. What feels safe to them, what feels unsafe. That's a powerful data point that you can bring into a conversation if you don't have folks at the table that can support you. So when you think about this sort of auditing, there's three big key holder groups that you should consider: staff, families, and students.
So first we're going to jump into staff. And some of the things that we're going to talk about here, it might sound repetitive, but that's only because it's really important. And they kind of thread throughout the whole session. Again, Chris just talked about auditing your decision makers. Sometimes when we talk about text selections, depending on the type of curriculum your school uses or the type of district you're in. So if you're in a decentralized district, sometimes you have a little bit more freedom to shape the curriculum the way you want it to, the way you go about having classroom libraries, school libraries. It might look differently than a smaller centralized district, or it might be your approach to instruction. So if you're a campus that has an interdisciplinary approach, then the people that you invite to the table for text selection, whether it's for a classroom or curriculum, will look differently than maybe a traditional setting. So again, is it always your ELA teachers invited to the table for text selections? Because you might have your history teacher using historical fiction, nonfiction books in the classroom, embedding it in their curriculum. So they need to be a part of that conversation. You might have different types of humanity courses where they're reading different types of literature. So really looking at the different purposes of text at your school and making sure your committee kind of represents a full picture of the staff involved. Again, Chris mentioned, really important to have your librarian, your media specialist involved because they're well trained in how to navigate the selection process. They're very aware of policies, national, district-wide, around censorship, book bans, and things of that nature. Leaders have a very key role in setting the tone at campuses around selections as well as challenges. Because it's kind of like you're the captain of that ship, right? So like your attitude towards reading, it seeps through the classroom. So think about the culture you're providing at your campus around reading. Why do we have diverse texts? What's our philosophy around diverse texts and how we celebrate identities and cultures? How do you make space for that? Do you have book clubs for your teachers? Do you give your teachers the time and space to discuss books with each other, with their students, with you? I know in the classroom, I had multiple responsibilities. So when I just started, packets were handed to me. Here's your novel, here's your packet, here's your scripted lesson, go forth and teach. I did not always have the time then to really go through line by line with some of the texts. Yes, I studied some chapters, but then I had a different principal who tried to make sure we had the time and space to dive into the text. So we were prepared in case a parent had an issue with the text. We were, we knew what was in there and we could navigate those waters. The final thing, communicate and offer support. How well or how versed are the staff members in the policy? So whether it's your challenge policy or your text selection policy, how well or how familiar is the staff with that policy? How frequently is it updated by you or the campus or the district? And how do you disseminate that information to your teachers? And what type of support do you provide for them? Something that was helpful to me was when my principal gave us parent letters. When I was in the 11th grade and we had some hard-hitting novels, she said, be proactive, right? Cindy mentioned that. Reach out to your parents, explain, here are the texts we're going to read. Feel free to preview, contact me, we can talk about it. She also gave us stems, conversation stems. You will have a parent that might be angry about a book because, there's a religious difference. This is how you respond in that situation. So being mindful of where, meeting your staff where they are in terms of reading, communicating, and giving them that support.
And I just want to talk directly to leaders for just a moment. The districts that are handling these challenges the best are ones where leaders know the buck stops with them, that they are willing to pause. If you don't know, pause. Don't jump to a fast conclusion. Don't make a unilateral decision. Be willing to hold back the floodgates, to wait and get more information and reach out to your staff, but be the one to take the brunt of what's going on. Because once it trickles down into classrooms and starts affecting individual teachers and individual classroom libraries, that becomes an untenable situation. So leaders, the buck stops with you. When you think about families, this was actually a leader that said this to me that I thought was a really interesting take on what's happening now. She said, during COVID, we closed our schools. And even now when schools are reopened, we still have a lot of protocols in place that are not allowing the usual connection between families and kids and families and teachers that we normally would have. Like usually you'd have a bunch of families in your school picking up their kids, volunteering for this and that. You see them at drop off, but there's so much more distance between a lot of families and us. And over these years, that's 2-3 years of some families that have never been in our buildings, just some like virtual watching us on the screen. So consider that whatever you did before to build relationships with your family community, you probably need to triple those efforts in a virtual setting or triple those efforts if you're back in person again. It's much easier to yell at someone you don't know than it is to yell and be angry with someone who you have a relationship with, that you can trust, that you can talk to. And so consider that that is a piece of all of this. Communicate frequently and encourage them to be advocates. Something that Lois didn't mention, but she said in our planning, is that her principal had also given teachers some sentence stems for if a parent emailed or called you. And those were very helpful. They were ones that were like, thank you for your concern. I'd like to think more about this. Instead of getting into an altercation immediately or trying to shut down conversation, offering up a chance to talk and think more. Sometimes it's an opportunity for learning and reflection on both ends versus an immediate argument. And then students. Acknowledge that students are an essential part of all of this because they're readers too. And consider ways that you can bring in student voices. If your policy can involve student decision makers, excellent. If not, are there other ways to involve students' decisions and choices around text, perhaps inviting them to become more involved in sharing some book talks with the committee, or recording themselves with texts that they love, or keeping lists of what are the hot books that everyone's reading and why. Find ways to bring in student voices. And then last, that came from some of our think tank planners, surveys can be such a helpful tool. And you don't have to survey kids about specific books that are being challenged. You don't, that's putting them in an awkward position to say, someone thinks we shouldn't have Ghost Boys. What do you think? Instead, what you can do is offer surveys with very open-ended questions. Some of our think tank members said that they've surveyed their students, or they've surveyed school students, and just asked big questions like, what text do you prefer to read and why? What are things that we should be aware of how books are chosen in our school? What recommendations would you make about the ways we choose books? And keeping those conversations wide open, kids know, we all know that. Kids know, kids are willing to say what they like, what they need, what they're concerned by. Offering that option to gather student voices can give you other powerful data to bring back to communities. So we wanted to leave you, as we're up at the top of the hour here, with some resources as well. And so we just tweeted out this link. If you go to bit.ly/book challenge help, this is one curated page of a few essential resources. One of them is our Strong Classroom Self-Assessment, which was created by the TheEdCollab think tank several years ago. And there's a section on looking carefully at your classroom library and some helpful tools that you can do to audit that. There's also a link to the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom. I want to very clearly say to you that the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom accepts anonymous concerns about book banning and will provide you with resources and sometimes even speakers or legal support if that happens to be happening in your district. ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom. Please visit them if you need to, as well as the NCT Intellectual Freedom Center. And there's some other links on that page as well too. Feel free to use that and share that widely. So I just want to thank Shawna, Lois, Cindy, and Keri for presenting with us today. Thank you for your insights and your support. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm going to awkwardly switch my screen just a second here to give a formal thank you and goodbye to everyone. As you are navigating this challenging era that we're in, please just keep in mind that there is power in books. While books can't make someone gay, books don't make someone feel unsafe around the police if they don't already. Books don't make people XYZ whatever. Books can, though, make people feel seen and heard and understand themselves better, and can literally save lives. Books can make a child see themselves in a way that doesn't make them want to harm themselves or harm others. Books help us to build bridges through one another. If books didn't have that ability, people would not be attacking them because they are powerful. So when you feel nervous and worried in this time that we're in, remember that every action that you take to protect readers is an action you take to help and support your entire community beyond just your school, nationally and globally as well too. So thank you for the work that you do. If you're inspired by today's work, please do consider donating to one of our adopted charities. You can find them on our charity page. We invite you to come back and present with us or join our tech team for September 24th's Fall TheEdCollab gathering. And please do tune in as well. Those proposals are open until June 30th, and we hope that you'll accept them. If, by the way, you're like, I'd love to, but I'm nervous, reach out to anyone that presented today and ask them how it went, and they can give you some tips as well too. So thank you to this closing session presenters. Thank you to Lewin this morning. Thanks to all of you who presented. We're tech team and tuned in today. Have a great rest of your weekend. And thanks for all that you do for your kids, for your colleagues, and for our amazing profession. Take care, everyone.